I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. Sitting in the corner of the break room at work, the faint hum of the vending machines the only sound in the room, I felt the heat of Deshawn's gaze on me. He was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, his confidence so natural it bordered on arrogance. I should have left when the others filtered out, but something about the way he stayed behind made it impossible for me to move. "Late nights seem to suit you," he said, his voice smooth and teasing. I looked up, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened under his attention. "And here I thought you were the one burning the midnight oil." He grinned, his smile disarming. "Can't lie. I was hoping you'd still be here." My breath caught. There it was, direct, unapologetic, and completely out of line. I should have said something, should have told him this was inappropriate, but instead I just stared at him, unsure of how to respond. "Evelyn," he said, his tone softening, "you ever let someone tell you how incredible you are?" "Deshawn," I said quietly, warningly, but he didn't back down. He stepped closer, his dark eyes locked on mine, the scent of his cologne enveloping me. For a moment, I forgot who I was. Forgot I was his boss. Forgot I was 52 years old and should have known better. "I'm serious," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're incredible." The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to tell him to stop, to step away, but the words caught in my throat. That was the moment everything changed. Deshawn wasn't the first younger man I'd been involved with. Since my divorce, there had been others. Brief, passionate, but ultimately meaningless encounters that filled a void I didn't want to admit I had. But Deshawn was different. He wasn't just confident. He made me feel something I hadn't felt in decades. Alive. I didn't realize it then, but that moment in the break room was the beginning of something that would unravel my carefully constructed life. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though I'm not entirely sure when it all truly began. Maybe it was the day Deshawn first walked into the conference room, a new hire with an easy smile and a self-assuredness that made the entire team sit up a little straighter. Maybe it was when I caught him looking at me during a meeting, his eyes lingering a second longer than they should have. Or maybe it was long before that, when I realized that after my divorce, loneliness had become less of a passing feeling and more of a permanent state of being. I'm Evelyn. 52 years old, divorced for nearly a decade, and a senior marketing director at Apex Interactive, a powerhouse in the gaming industry. It's a fast-paced, competitive environment, and I've spent the better part of my career proving that I belong here. My days are filled with deadlines, client calls, and late nights at the office. My evenings are quieter, spent in a small but comfortable apartment with the occasional glass of wine and a rerun of whatever show I can find. It's not a bad life, but it's not the one I'd imagined for myself either. My daughter Sophia is in her 20s now, building a life of her own on the other side of the country. We talk often enough, but there's a distance between us that wasn't always there. She sees me as strong, independent, and resilient, all the things I want her to see. What she doesn't see, what no one sees, is the part of me that craves something more. Deshawn was hired 6 months ago, part of a push to bring in fresh talent to our team. At 24, he was one of the youngest on the staff, but it didn't take long for him to stand out. He wasn't just good at his job, he was brilliant. His ideas were bold, his execution flawless, and he had a way of making people listen when he spoke. There was an energy about him, a confidence, that seemed to fill the room whenever he entered it. At first, I chalked it up to youth. He was at that stage in life where everything felt possible, where ambition and idealism hadn't yet been worn down by the realities of the world. But as the weeks went on, I started to notice other things. The way he smiled at me during meetings, as if we shared some unspoken joke. The way he sought me out for feedback on his projects, even when it wasn't necessary. The way he seemed to find excuses to be near me, whether it was lingering in the break room or asking me about a campaign I'd worked on years ago. I told myself it was harmless. He was young, ambitious, and eager to make an impression. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The turning point came during a late-night brainstorming session. We were preparing for a major pitch, and the entire team had been working overtime to get everything ready. Most of the staff had gone home by 7 p.m., leaving just a handful of us in the office. I was at my desk, poring over the latest revisions when Deshaun appeared in the doorway. "Burning the midnight oil again?" he asked, leaning casually against the frame. "Deadlines wait for no one," I said, offering a faint smile. He stepped inside, holding up 2 paper cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this." I accepted the cup, the warmth of it seeping into my hands. "Thanks." "You didn't have to do that." "Consider it a peace offering," he said, his smile widening. "Peace offering for what?" "For stealing your idea in the meeting this morning," he said, his tone light but sincere. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You didn't steal anything, you built on it. That's what a good team does." His expression softened, and for a moment the playful edge in his demeanor faded. "You're good at this, you know, better than anyone here." The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. "I've been doing this a long time. Doesn't mean you're not brilliant," he said, his voice quieter now. I looked away, focusing on the papers scattered across my desk. "Flattery won't get you out of finishing your work." He chuckled, but he didn't leave. Instead, he pulled a chair up beside me, his proximity sending a flicker of unease through me. "Mind if I stay for a bit?" he asked. "I could use a second opinion on something." "Suit yourself," I said, keeping my tone casual. For the next hour we worked side by side, our conversation shifting between campaign strategies and the occasional personal anecdote. He told me about the small indie games he'd worked on before joining Apex, the passion projects that had driven him to pursue a career in the industry. I told him about my early days in marketing, back when gaming was still seen as a niche industry and women like me were a rarity in the field. "You must have been tough as hell," he said, his admiration evident. "You had to be," I said. "But it was worth it." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than necessary. "You make it look easy." "It's not," I said quietly. His expression shifted, and for a moment the air between us felt different, charged in a way I couldn't quite define. I cleared my throat, breaking the tension. "We should call it a night," I said, gathering my papers. "It's late." "Yeah," he said, standing. "I'll walk you out." I didn't argue. As we stood in the elevator, the silence between us felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. When the doors opened, he held them for me, his smile warm and easy. "Good night, Evelyn," he said, his voice soft. "Good night, Deshaun," I replied, stepping out into the cool night air. As I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something I wasn't sure I could or wanted to ignore. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake. An impulsive moment born of late nights, too many lingering glances, and a craving for something I hadn't felt in years. But even then, deep down, I knew it wasn't the last time. It started with a message. The week after our late-night brainstorming session, Deshaun texted me at nearly 10 p.m. "Still up? Got something I want to run by you." I stared at the screen, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't unusual for colleagues to exchange late-night work messages, especially in our industry, but this felt different. There was no subject line, no attachment, just a pretense thin enough to be see-through. "Sure," I replied after a moment, trying to keep my tone neutral. Within minutes, my phone buzzed again. "Meet me at Lux. Drinks on me." Lux was a sleek lounge downtown, more popular with our younger employees than someone like me. I hesitated, typing and deleting a dozen excuses before finally giving in. "Just one drink," I replied, as if that would set some kind of boundary. When I arrived, he was already there, seated in a quiet corner with 2 glasses of red wine on the table. He stood when he saw me, his smile lighting up the dimly lit room. "You came," he said, his tone warm but tinged with satisfaction. "I figured you'd have something work-related," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. "We can talk work," he said, leaning back with that effortless confidence. "But that's not why I asked you here." I should have left right then. I should have made an excuse, reminded him, and myself, that this was crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But instead, I stayed. The conversation started innocently enough. We talked about the upcoming campaign, our frustrations with management, and the challenges of staying creative in a corporate environment. But as the night went on, the tone shifted. "You're different, you know," he said, his voice low as he swirled the wine in his glass. "Different how?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "You're not like the others," he said, leaning forward. You don't just play the game, you redefine it. That's rare. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, equal parts flattery and discomfort. I've been doing this a long time. It's not just experience, he said, it's you. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. He was looking at me like I was the only person in the room, and it terrified me how much I liked it. Deshawn, I said softly, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But he didn't let me. You ever let yourself have what you really want? He asked, his gaze unwavering. The question caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. Before I could, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. I think you deserve that, he said quietly. The night ended in the parking lot. We walked out together, the cool night air doing little to calm the heat building between us. When we reached my car, I turned to him, searching for the words to put an end to whatever this was becoming. But before I could speak, he closed the distance between us, his hands gently gripping my waist as he kissed me. It wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was confident, deliberate, and completely overwhelming. I felt myself melting into him, my hands clutching his shoulders as every rational thought disappeared. When we finally broke apart, I stared at him, breathless and trembling. We can't do this, I whispered, though my body was screaming for the opposite. Why not? He asked, his voice steady. Because it's wrong, I said, my words weak even to my own ears. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. The way he looked at me, like I was something rare, something worth breaking the rules for, was enough to silence every protest. The first time we were together was in his car. I didn't plan it. In fact, I'd sworn to myself that I wouldn't let it happen. But a few nights after that kiss, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. I had to see you, he said, standing in the doorway, his presence both thrilling and terrifying. I tried to send him away, but the words died in my throat. Before I knew it, I was in the passenger seat of his car, the city lights blurring as we drove to a secluded spot overlooking the skyline. What happened next was inevitable. The car was small, the space between us even smaller. His touch was gentle but insistent, his lips tracing a path down my neck as I leaned back against the seat. I couldn't stop myself, didn't want to stop myself, as he made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. When it was over, we sat in silence, the windows fogged and the air thick with the weight of what we'd done. I've wanted this since the day I met you, he said, his voice breaking the stillness. I didn't respond. I couldn't. After that night, everything changed. We couldn't keep away from each other. It started with stolen moments at the office, brushing past each other in the hallway, his hand lingering on mine during meetings, the way his gaze would burn into me from across the room. Then came the late-night rendezvous. His apartment, my car, quiet corners of the office after everyone had gone home. Every encounter was a risk, but the danger only made it more intoxicating. I told myself it was just a phase, something I'd end before it went too far. But with every touch, every kiss, every whispered confession, I felt myself falling deeper into him. I thought we could keep it quiet, that we could manage the risks, but nothing about being with Deshawn felt manageable. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath me, yet I couldn't bring myself to step back. We'd fallen into a rhythm, one built on secrecy and stolen moments. It started with nights at his apartment. His place was small, almost minimalist, the kind of apartment that screamed young bachelor. The walls were bare except for a couple of posters from indie games, and his shelves were filled with books on coding and design. The first time I was there, I couldn't stop myself from laughing softly as I looked around. "What's so funny?" he asked, his arms sliding around my waist from behind. "You live like a college kid," I teased, turning to face him. "And you love it," he said, his grin mischievous as he leaned in to kiss me. He wasn't wrong. Our nights together were electric. He made me feel things I hadn't felt in decades. Alive, wanted, like I was something more than just my title at work, or the woman who filled her evenings with wine and old movies. But it wasn't just about the physical connection. Deshawn had a way of looking at me, of making me feel seen, that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "You know what I love about you?" he said one night as we lay tangled together, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. "What's that?" I asked, my voice soft. You don't settle, he said. You go after what you want, even if it scares you. His words stuck with me, lingering in the back of my mind long after I left his apartment that night. It wasn't long before we started pushing the boundaries of our secrecy. At work, we were careful, or at least, we tried to be. But the moments between us, the glances and brief touches, felt impossible to hide. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone in the elevator after a team meeting. The tension was palpable, the air between us crackling with unspoken desire. Someone could see us, I whispered, my back pressed against the wall as he stepped closer. They won't, he said, his voice low, his hand brushing against mine. The elevator doors opened before anything could happen, and we stepped out, pretending nothing had transpired. But my heart was racing for the rest of the day. It wasn't just at work. Deshawn started getting bolder, suggesting riskier places to meet. One evening, after a long day at the office, he texted me. Meet me at the Vista. The Vista was a luxury hotel downtown, one known for its privacy and discretion. I hesitated, staring at the message, knowing how reckless it was, but the pull of him was too strong to resist. The hotel room was sleek and modern, the city skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The moment I stepped inside, he was there, pulling me into his arms, his kiss searing away any lingering doubts. This is crazy, I murmured against his lips, my hands clutching at his shirt. I don't care, he said, his voice filled with conviction. I just want you. The rest of the night was a blur of heat and passion, the kind of intensity that left me breathless and craving more. As the weeks went on, our connection only deepened. It wasn't just about the physical anymore, though that was still a driving force. We started sharing more of ourselves, peeling back the layers of who we were outside of work. He told me about his childhood, growing up in Atlanta with a single mom who worked 2 jobs to support him and his sister. About the indie game he'd built in college that never quite took off, but taught him everything he needed to know about perseverance. I told him about my divorce, about how I'd spent years putting my career ahead of everything else, only to end up alone in a house that felt too big for one person. You're not alone now, he said one night, his hand resting on mine. The simplicity of his words hit me harder than I expected. But the deeper we fell, the more complicated things became. Deshawn started wanting more time together, more openness about our relationship. We don't have to keep sneaking around, he said one night as we lay in bed, the glow of the city lights casting shadows across the room. You know we do, I said, turning to face him. If anyone finds out. I don't care what people think, he said, cutting me off. I care about you. His words should have comforted me, but instead, they filled me with dread. The risks we were taking didn't go unnoticed. Carla, my best friend at work, started asking questions. She'd always been perceptive, and it didn't take long for her to notice the subtle shifts in my behavior. You've been distracted lately, she said one afternoon as we grabbed coffee in the break room. Just busy, I said, avoiding her gaze. It's more than that, she pressed. What's going on, Evelyn? I hesitated, debating whether to tell her the truth, but the weight of what I was hiding felt too heavy to share. Nothing, I said finally. I'm fine. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push further. Then there was Amber. Amber was one of the younger employees on the team, sharp and ambitious, but prone to gossip. I'd noticed her watching me and Deshawn more closely in recent weeks, her eyes narrowing whenever we were in the same room. One afternoon, as I walked past her desk, I heard her whispering to another coworker. The words were muffled, but I caught enough to know what she was saying. She's old enough to be his mother, Amber said, her tone dripping with disdain. The comment stung more than I wanted to admit. Despite the growing tension, I couldn't bring myself to end things. Deshawn had become a lifeline, a source of light in a life that had felt stagnant for so long. But as the walls around us started closing in, I began to wonder how much longer we could keep this up before everything came crashing down. I knew it was going to fall apart. Things like this always do. We'd been careless, or maybe it was inevitable. You can only slip through the cracks for so long before someone notices. And at Apex, the cracks were smaller than I realized. It started with a confrontation I didn't see coming. Amber, the ambitious and sharp-tongued coworker who had been watching Deshawn and me for weeks, caught me in the hallway after a team meeting. Evelyn, Can I talk to you for a second? She asked, her voice all sweetness, but her smile razor sharp. I nodded, though her tone set me on edge. Of course. We stepped into an empty conference room, and as soon as the door shut, her expression hardened. I'm going to get straight to the point, she said, her voice low. I know about you and Deshawn. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She tilted her head, her smile widening. You don't have to play dumb with me. I've seen the way you look at him, the way he looks at you. People are starting to talk, Evelyn. You might want to think about how that looks for someone in your position. Her words carried a thinly veiled threat, and I knew exactly what she was implying. This isn't appropriate, I said sharply. If you have an issue with me, take it to HR. Oh, don't worry, she said, her eyes narrowing. I will. Unless, of course, you decide to resign before things get messy. I stared at her, my chest tightening. She was bluffing, or at least I hoped she was. That evening, I met Deshawn at his apartment, my mind racing with what Amber had said. She's just trying to scare you, he said, pacing the small living room. She doesn't have proof. She doesn't need proof, I said, my voice trembling. All she has to do is raise questions, and my career is over. Deshawn stopped, turning to face me. Then let me handle it. I'll tell HR it was all me, that I pursued you. No, I said firmly. I won't let you ruin your career for me. He stepped closer, his hands gripping my shoulders. I don't care about my career, Evelyn. I care about you. His words were meant to comfort me, but they only made the weight on my chest heavier. A week later, everything came crashing down. It was a Friday morning, and I was sitting at my desk when an email from HR popped into my inbox. Subject: HR inquiry, confidential. My stomach dropped. The email was short and to the point. Evelyn, please report to HR at 3 p.m. today to discuss an internal matter. This is a mandatory meeting. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. This was it. I called Deshawn immediately. They know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What are you going to do? He asked finally. I don't know, I admitted. The meeting was worse than I'd imagined. 3 HR reps sat across from me in a cold, windowless room. The head of HR, a stern woman named Victoria, slid a folder across the table. Evelyn, we've received reports of inappropriate conduct involving you and a subordinate employee, she said, her tone even but firm. I opened the folder, my breath catching as I saw the printed screenshots of text messages and emails between Deshawn and me. Where did you get these? I asked, my voice shaking. Victoria didn't answer. We need you to confirm whether these messages are legitimate, she said. I hesitated, my mind racing. Denying it would only make things worse. Yes, I said finally, my voice barely audible. They're real. Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. Thank you for your honesty. We'll be conducting a full review of this matter and will follow up with you once a decision has been made. The meeting ended, and as I walked out of the room, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a stone. That evening, I met Deshawn at a bar downtown. The normally confident, easygoing man I'd fallen for looked tense, his jaw tight as he waited for me to sit down. What did they say? He asked, his voice low. They're reviewing it, I said. But we both know what that means. He reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. Let me fix this, he said. I'll tell them it was all me. No, I said, shaking my head. We both made this choice, Deshawn. We'll deal with the consequences together. For the first time, he didn't argue. The fallout came quickly. By Monday morning, the rumors had spread throughout the office. Whispers followed me wherever I went, and the once friendly smiles of my coworkers had turned to cold stares. Carla, my closest friend at work, stopped by my office that afternoon. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice filled with hurt. I didn't want to drag you into it, I said, my eyes welling with tears. She sighed, shaking her head. I don't know what you were thinking, Evelyn, but I hope it was worth it. Her words stung, but I couldn't blame her. By the end of the week, HR made their decision. I was given 2 options: resign quietly or face termination. I chose the former. Deshawn was suspended for a month, but allowed to keep his job, though he was reassigned to a different team. I told him not to fight it, that it was better this way. This isn't fair, he said, his voice filled with frustration. It's the best we can hope for, I said quietly. As I packed up my office, the reality of what I'd lost began to sink in. My career, my reputation, the life I'd built over decades, it was all gone. Deshaun offered to leave with me, to start fresh somewhere else. But I told him no. You still have a future here, I said. Don't throw that away for me. He didn't agree, but he didn't argue either. The day I left Apex Interactive, I walked out of the building feeling both lighter and heavier than I'd ever felt before. I didn't know what was next, but I knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. In the weeks after I left Apex Interactive, the world around me seemed to slow down. My mornings were no longer filled with meetings or the buzz of emails. Instead, I found myself sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, staring out at a city that had kept moving while my life had come to a standstill. I had spent decades building my career, pouring everything into becoming someone I could be proud of. But now, all I could see were the cracks, mistakes I couldn't undo, decisions that had unraveled everything I thought I was. Deshaun called often, but I let most of his calls go to voicemail. It's not your fault, he said in one message, his voice heavy with guilt. You know that, right? This wasn't all on you. But it didn't feel that way. Every time I heard his voice, I thought about the choices we'd made, the risks we'd taken, and the way it had all fallen apart. Still, I couldn't bring myself to cut him off completely. He was a reminder of something I couldn't quite let go. A piece of me that I didn't want to admit I missed. Sophia, my daughter, heard about what happened from a former coworker. Mom, she said during one of our weekly calls, her voice hesitant. Is it true? What they're saying about you and someone from work? I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. Yes, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to see me like this, I said, tears threatening to spill. I don't care about that, she said, her tone softening. I just want to understand why. I struggled to find the words, to explain how lonely I'd felt, how Deshaun had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But I couldn't say any of that without sounding selfish. I made a mistake, I said finally. A big one. Sophia sighed, the disappointment in her voice cutting through me. I love you, Mom, but I think you need to figure out what you want, because this isn't who you are. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. One evening, a month after I'd left Apex, I received a text from Deshaun. I miss you. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long time, my emotions warring between longing and guilt. I missed him too, missed the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me like I was something extraordinary. But I also knew that being with him had cost me everything. I typed out a response, deleting it twice before finally sending, I need time. He replied almost immediately. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. In the months that followed, I began to piece my life back together. I found freelance work, small projects that kept me busy but didn't demand the kind of intensity my career at Apex had required. I spent more time with Sophia, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been strained between us. And I learned how to sit with myself, with the loneliness, the regret, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to start over. The last time I heard from Deshaun was on a rainy Tuesday evening. He sent me a single message. I hope you're okay. I'll always care about you. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I needed to let him go. As much as I had loved the way he made me feel, I knew it was time to find that sense of worth within myself. In the end, what Deshaun gave me wasn't just passion or excitement. It was a reminder that I was still capable of feeling, of taking risks, of being vulnerable. But now it was up to me to figure out what came next. It started with an innocent mistake. I had spent the morning tidying up the house, an endless cycle of folding laundry, dusting shelves, and trying to ignore the quiet emptiness that had settled over my life in recent years. Derek, my stepson, had left a trail of chaos after moving back home from college a month ago. Between his laundry strewn across the couch and the steady stream of his friends coming and going, the house was livelier than it had been in years. And yet, I still felt like a ghost floating through it. That day, I found myself in his room, determined to reclaim some semblance of order. I pushed open the door without a second thought, balancing a basket of clean clothes on my hip. What I wasn't expecting was Jake. He was standing near the bed, his back to me, shirtless and mid-change. My breath hitched before I could stop it. His broad shoulders and defined back were illuminated by the soft afternoon light streaming through the window. "Whoa!" Jake exclaimed, spinning around as he hurriedly pulled his t-shirt over his head. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I stammered, the laundry basket nearly slipping from my hands as I turned on my heel. "It's fine," he said quickly, his voice filled with amusement. "I didn't think anyone was home." I paused in the doorway, feeling my cheeks burn. "I should have knocked. I thought Derek was here." Jake laughed softly, the sound warm and familiar. "He ran out to pick up lunch. I'm just grabbing my stuff." When I finally dared to glance back, his easy smile disarmed me. He wasn't embarrassed, not like I was. If anything, he seemed almost amused by my flustered reaction. "Well," I said, clearing my throat, "I'll just leave these here." I placed the basket on the edge of the bed and fled the room, my heart racing. Jake had always been a fixture in our lives. He and Derek had been inseparable since they were kids, practically growing up in this house. I used to watch them tear through the backyard, muddy and full of energy, while I sipped coffee on the porch. But Jake wasn't a kid anymore. At 25, he'd grown into someone I barely recognized. Confident, charming, with a sharp wit and a quiet intensity that had a way of filling the room. I hadn't noticed the shift until that moment in Derek's room, and now I couldn't stop noticing. Later that evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, Jake wandered in, leaning casually against the counter. "Hey," he said, his tone light. "Sorry about earlier. Didn't mean to give you a heart attack." I forced a laugh, though the memory of his bare shoulders still lingered in the back of my mind. "No harm done. Just knock next time," I teased, hoping to deflect my own awkwardness. "Fair enough," he said, flashing me that easy grin. "So what's for dinner?" "Lasagna," I replied, gesturing to the pan in the oven. "You're welcome to stay, if you're hungry." "I'm always hungry," he said with a wink, grabbing a glass of water. As he moved around the kitchen, there was a new ease to his presence, a quiet confidence that I hadn't noticed before. He asked about my day, about the projects I was working on around the house, and listened intently as I spoke. It was such a simple interaction, but it left me feeling seen. After dinner, Derek and Jake retreated to the living room to watch a game, their laughter filling the house. I lingered in the kitchen, cleaning up but finding it hard to focus. My mind kept drifting back to that moment in Derek's room. The way Jake had looked at me, the casualness of his smile, the way his presence seemed to linger long after he'd left the room. For years, I'd been living on autopilot, my days a blur of chores and quiet evenings spent alone. Since my husband's passing, I'd thrown myself into keeping the house running, convincing myself that was enough. But lately, with Derek and Jake around, the house had started to feel alive again. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain, Jake's presence had started to feel different. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into a fleeting moment. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Jake wasn't just Derek's friend anymore. And the thought both terrified and thrilled me. The following days passed in a blur of ordinary routines, yet I couldn't shake the lingering effects of that fleeting encounter with Jake. I told myself it was nothing, a harmless, awkward moment that would fade with time. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more aware I became of him. Jake's visits to the house had become more frequent, a byproduct of his friendship with Derek and his new job nearby. He'd stop by for meals, hang out in the living room, and occasionally help with small projects around the house. Each time he walked through the door, the energy in the house shifted, and I found myself torn between wanting to avoid him and hoping for his company. One afternoon, as I stood in the backyard pruning the rose bushes, I heard footsteps behind me. "Need some help?" Jake's voice was warm, laced with a playful edge. I turned to find him standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his easy smile disarming as always. "I think I've got it," I replied, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Come on," he said, stepping closer. "You've got dirt all over you. You could use an extra set of hands." I laughed despite myself, handing him the clippers. "Fine, but don't butcher them. These roses have been here longer than you." "Noted," he said, his grin widening as he crouched down beside me. As we worked side by side, the conversation flowed easily. Jake had always been good at filling the silence, his quick wit and humor keeping things light. But today there was something different in his tone, something quieter, more thoughtful. "You've done a great job keeping this place up," he said, gesturing to the garden. "Thanks," I said, pausing to wipe my hands on my jeans. "It's a lot of work, but it keeps me busy." Jake glanced at me, his expression softening. "You do everything around here, don't you?" I shrugged, trying to downplay the compliment. "It's just me. Someone has to." "Well, you make it look easy," he said, his voice quieter now. The sincerity in his words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Jake told me about his new job, the challenges he was facing, and the long hours he'd been putting in. "It's not what I expected," he admitted, setting the clippers down. "But it feels good to be doing something on my own, you know?" I nodded, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "It suits you," I said, and I meant it. There was a confidence in him now, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. He smiled, his gaze lingering on mine for just a moment too long. "Thanks, Claire, that means a lot." Later, as we gathered the clippings and cleaned up, our hands brushed briefly, and I felt a spark, subtle but undeniable. I glanced up at him, my breath catching when I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken. "Thanks for the help," I said quickly, stepping back to create some distance. "Anytime," he replied, his tone light but his gaze steady. As he walked back toward the house, I stood there, the clippers still in my hand, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't or wouldn't name. That evening, as I prepared dinner, Jake wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of garlic and herbs. "Something smells amazing," he said, leaning against the counter. "It's just spaghetti," I said, laughing softly. "If this is just spaghetti, then I'm staying for dinner," he said with a grin. I shook my head but couldn't help the smile tugging at my lips. "Fine. But you're on dish duty." "Deal," he said, grabbing plates from the cupboard without being asked. As we sat down to eat, Derek joined us, his easy banter filling the room. But my attention kept drifting to Jake. The way he laughed, the way he listened intently when I spoke, the way his presence seemed to ground the space around him. At one point, I caught his gaze across the table, and the warmth in his eyes made my breath hitch. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else would have noticed, but it left me unsettled in the best and worst ways. After dinner, as Jake washed the dishes and Derek disappeared upstairs, I found myself lingering in the kitchen. "You didn't have to stay and help," I said, leaning against the counter. "I don't mind," he replied, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. For a moment, the only sound was the clink of plates and the rush of water from the sink. Then Jake spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You don't give yourself enough credit, you know." I frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "You do so much for everyone," he said, shutting off the water and turning to face me. "But I don't think anyone's taking care of you." The sincerity in his voice left me speechless. I looked away, the weight of his words settling over me. "I'm fine," I said, though the words felt hollow. "You deserve more than fine, Claire," he said, his voice steady but soft. When I finally met his gaze, there was something in his eyes that made my chest tighten, an honesty that I wasn't ready to face. "Good night, Jake," I said quietly, retreating before I could let myself feel too much. As I lay in bed that night, his words echoed in my mind. "You deserve more than fine." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. How much I needed someone to see me, not as Derek's stepmother or a widow, but as a woman. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder, what if he was right? The next morning, I found Jake in the backyard again, this time tinkering with the squeaky garden gate that had driven me crazy for months. He didn't ask if I needed it fixed, he just took it upon himself, as if sensing the little things I didn't have the energy to manage. "You know, I could have called someone to fix that," I said, stepping onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. Jake looked up, the sunlight catching the mischievous glint in his eyes. "Why call someone when I'm right here?" "Fair point," I said, smiling despite myself. As he tightened the last screw, I couldn't help but admire how comfortable he seemed, how he moved through my life with such ease, like he belonged here. "Try it now," he said, stepping back and gesturing to the gate. I pushed it open, and for the first time in years, it didn't squeak. Impressive, I said, handing him the coffee as a reward. Glad to help, he replied, taking a sip before leaning casually against the porch railing. We ended up sitting together on the steps, the morning air crisp and quiet. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so at ease, just sitting and talking to someone. So, what's next on the to-do list? He asked, glancing at me with that easy smile of his. I think the question is, what's next on your to-do list? I countered. Don't you have your own life to worry about? He shrugged, his smile softening. I like being here. It feels good. His words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I appreciate everything you've been doing, I said finally, my voice quieter now. But you don't have to take care of me, Jake. Maybe I want to, he said, his gaze steady. The simplicity of his statement left me breathless. I felt my defenses begin to crack, the wall I'd built around myself slowly crumbling under the weight of his kindness. We sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between us growing thicker with each passing moment. Do you ever think about leaving this place? He asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. I glanced at him, startled by the question. Sometimes, I admitted, but it's hard to leave something so full of memories. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Memories are important, but they're not everything. I stared down at my coffee, his words stirring something deep within me. Maybe not, I said softly, but they're all I've had for so long. That evening, after Derek had gone out to meet friends, Jake lingered in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. I found myself standing in the doorway, watching him, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I couldn't say. Hey, he said, noticing me. You okay? Yeah, I said quickly, stepping into the room. Just tired. He turned off the TV and sat up, his attention fully on me now. Want to sit? He asked, patting the spot next to him on the couch. I hesitated, but the warmth in his gaze drew me in. I sat down, careful to keep a small distance between us, though the space felt charged. We talked about everything and nothing, our voices low in the quiet of the house. Jake told me more about his work, his plans, and the doubts he carried about whether he was on the right path. It's hard, he admitted, feeling like you're supposed to have it all figured out, but you don't. I think that's everyone, I said, my voice soft. I'm twice your age, and I still don't have it all figured out. He laughed quietly, his gaze lingering on mine. You seem like you do, he said. I'm a good actress, I replied, smiling faintly. The conversation grew more personal, the walls between us crumbling with every word. I found myself telling him things I hadn't said out loud in years, how lonely I'd been since my husband's passing, how I felt like I was just going through the motions. Jake listened intently, his expression soft and full of understanding. You're stronger than you think, he said quietly. Maybe, I said, my voice trembling, but sometimes I don't want to be strong anymore. He reached out then, his hand covering mine. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that left me breathless. You don't have to do it all alone, he said, his voice low. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that terrified and thrilled me all at once. Jake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't a good idea. Why not? He asked gently, his thumb brushing against my hand. Because it's complicated, I said, pulling my hand away. Everything worth having is, he replied, his voice steady. The conviction in his words left me speechless, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the TV in the background. Eventually I stood, my heart racing. Good night, Jake, I said, my voice shaking slightly. Good night, Claire, he replied, his gaze never leaving mine. As I walked upstairs, I felt the weight of his words pressing against me, the quiet promise of something I wasn't sure I could let myself want. In the quiet of my room, I stood by the window, staring out at the darkened yard. For so long, I'd convinced myself that my life was over, that I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it. But now, with Jake's words echoing in my mind, I found myself wondering, what if there was more? The next morning, the house was quieter than usual. Derek had left early for work, and the absence of his usual noise left the space feeling strangely intimate. I found myself in the kitchen, absently wiping down the counters when Jake wandered in, hair still damp from his shower. Morning, he said, his voice warm and easy. Morning, I replied, my gaze flickering to the coffee pot. Help yourself. He poured a cup and leaned against the counter, watching me with a small smile. You always this busy? It keeps me sane, I said lightly, though I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. You don't have to do everything, you know, he said softly. The simplicity of his words caught me off guard, and I looked at him, my chest tightening. By mid-morning, we found ourselves in the garage, sorting through boxes that hadn't been touched in years. It had started as a casual suggestion, but the task quickly became a shared endeavor, our laughter echoing in the confined space as we unearthed old memories. Look at this, Jake said, holding up a faded Polaroid of Derek and himself as kids. They were both covered in mud, their grins wide and unapologetic. I remember that day, I said, smiling despite myself. You two tracked dirt through the entire house. Paul was furious. Jake laughed, setting the photo aside. We thought we were invincible back then. You were, I said quietly, the memory tugging at something deep inside me. He looked at me then, his expression softening. You've always been so good to us, Claire. The sincerity in his voice left me momentarily breathless. As the hours passed, the task grew lighter, the conversation turning to dreams and plans. Jake told me about the places he wanted to travel, the things he wanted to accomplish, and I listened, captivated by his quiet determination. At one point, I reached for a box at the same time he did, our hands brushing briefly. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back quickly, my heart racing. Sorry, I said, my voice unsteady. Don't be, he replied, his gaze steady. The moment hung between us, charged and heavy, but neither of us moved to break it. Later, as we stood by the workbench organizing tools, Jake turned to me, his expression unreadable. Claire, he said, his voice quieter now. Yes? He hesitated, his hands resting on the edge of the bench. Do you ever think about more? The question caught me off guard, and I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. More? I echoed. With your life, he said, his gaze meeting mine. What you want, what makes you happy? I swallowed hard, his words cutting through me. I don't know, I admitted. I've spent so long just getting through the days. I don't think I've let myself think about it. You should, he said softly. You deserve to. The weight of his words lingered long after we'd finished in the garage. That evening, as we sat on the back porch, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, I found myself replaying the day in my mind. Jake sat beside me, his presence steady and grounding. You've done so much for everyone else, he said suddenly. When do you do something for you? I glanced at him, startled by the question. I don't know how to, I said honestly. Maybe it's time to learn, he replied, his voice low but firm. The conversation shifted something in me, and as the evening wore on, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Jake's words weren't just a challenge. They were an invitation. By the time Derek came home, I'd retreated to the kitchen, needing space to collect myself. But even as I scrubbed the counters and tidied the dishes, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me was shifting. The next day, Jake and I found ourselves working on the living room together, rearranging furniture and patching up a few scuffed walls. The task was simple enough, but every glance, every accidental touch felt magnified, as if the room itself was conspiring to draw us closer. At one point, as I stood on a step stool to hang a picture, I felt the stool wobble beneath me. Careful, Jake said, stepping forward to steady it. I'm fine, I insisted, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He placed his hands on my waist to keep me steady, his touch warm and firm. Let me help, he said, his voice close to my ear. The moment was brief, but it left me breathless. When I stepped down, I turned to thank him, only to find him standing closer than I'd realized. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Claire, he said softly, his gaze searching mine. Jake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither of us moved, the space between us charged with unspoken tension. I started, but the words caught in my throat. Should you? He asked gently, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite name. I didn't know how to respond, so I turned away, retreating to the kitchen under the guise of needing water. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. For years, I'd convinced myself that my life was set, that my role as a widow and stepmother defined me. But now, with Jake's presence and his quiet insistence that I deserved more, I couldn't help but wonder. What if he was right? The house was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that amplified every sound, every movement. Derek had left to spend the weekend with friends, and for the first time in days, it was just Jake and me. I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta on the stove, the rhythmic clink of the wooden spoon against the pot the only sound. The air felt heavy, charged with the tension that had been building between us. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, soft but deliberate, as he walked into the kitchen. "Smells good," Jake said, his voice low. "Thanks," I replied, not looking up, afraid my eyes would betray me. "Need any help?" he asked, moving closer, his presence impossible to ignore. "No, I've got it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He lingered near the counter, his gaze on me, and I could feel it like a physical touch. "You always do, don't you?" he said softly. I turned to him then, startled by the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" "You take care of everyone, Claire," he said, his eyes steady on mine. "But who takes care of you?" The question hung in the air, raw and unanswerable. I felt my chest tighten, a lump forming in my throat. "I don't need." "Yes, you do," he interrupted gently, stepping closer. The space between us felt impossibly small, and I could feel my resolve weakening under the intensity of his gaze. "Jake, you don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be everything for everyone all the time." His words unraveled something inside me, a knot I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Without thinking, I turned off the stove and set the spoon down, my hands trembling. When I finally looked up at him, the vulnerability in his expression mirrored my own. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. "Because I care about you," he said, his voice steady and certain. "More than I probably should." The honesty in his words left me breathless, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was both tentative and desperate. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and longing spilling into that single moment. His hands rested gently on my waist as if he were afraid I might pull away, but I didn't. I couldn't. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. "This is crazy," I said, my voice shaky. "Maybe," he replied, his hands still holding me steady, "but it feels right." I searched his eyes, looking for doubt, but there was none. Only sincerity and a quiet determination that made my heart ache. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of whispered words and stolen touches. We moved to the living room, the dim light of the table lamp casting a warm glow over the space. We sat close, our knees brushing as we talked, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Jake told me about his fears, his dreams, the weight of expectations he'd been carrying. And I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't before, sharing parts of myself I'd kept hidden even from those closest to me. "You deserve to be happy, Claire," he said at one point, his hand covering mine. The simplicity of his statement brought tears to my eyes, and I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Later, as the night deepened, the atmosphere between us shifted again. Jake leaned in, his gaze searching mine, and I felt the air leave the room. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, his hand brushing lightly against my cheek. "Yes," I said, the single word carrying more certainty than I'd felt in years. What followed was a slow, deliberate exploration of everything we'd been holding back. His touch was gentle, reverent, as though he were memorizing every detail. And for the first time in years, I felt truly seen, truly cherished. We lay together on the couch afterward, the silence between us filled with unspoken understanding. His arm was draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing idle patterns on my arm. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the quiet. "More than okay," I replied, resting my head against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his touch grounding and comforting. "Good," he said simply. The reality of what had happened began to sink in as the night wore on. I knew the path we'd just stepped onto wouldn't be easy. There were questions, complications, and the ever-present fear of what Derek might think if he knew. But for the first time in years, I felt alive, and for now that was enough. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, as if reading my thoughts. "Together?" I asked, my voice tentative. "Together," he promised, his grip on me tightening slightly. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years I wasn't afraid of what it might hold. because with Jake by my side, I knew we could face whatever came next. The morning after was filled with quiet stillness. The sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the living room in soft, golden light. I woke up on the couch, tucked under Jake's arm, the blanket draped over us like a shield from the outside world. For a moment, I allowed myself to just be, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the warmth of his presence. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. When Jake stirred, his arm tightened around me for just a second before he opened his eyes. A small, sleepy smile crossed his face, and I couldn't help but return it. "Morning," he said softly, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither of us moved to get up, as if breaking this moment would bring the weight of reality crashing back down. Eventually, Jake sat up, his hand brushing lightly over my hair. "How are you feeling?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Confused," I admitted. "But happy." His smile widened slightly, and he reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. "Okay," I said, nodding. "One step at a time." The simplicity of his promise brought a strange sense of comfort. For so long, I'd been afraid to let myself feel, to let myself hope. But now, with Jake by my side, I was starting to believe that maybe I didn't have to do it all alone. The day passed quietly. Jake stayed to help me finish a few projects around the house, his presence steady and reassuring. It felt easy, like we'd settled into something unspoken but understood. But as the hours slipped by, the reality of our situation began to creep back in. Derek would be home that evening, and with him came the inevitable questions and complications. Jake noticed my tension as we worked in the kitchen, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. "Talk to me," he said gently. I turned to him, my chest tight with worry. "What if this doesn't work? What if we can't?" He cut me off, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out, Claire, together." His confidence was unwavering, and though doubt still lingered in my mind, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. That evening, as Jake prepared to leave, we stood by the front door, the air between us filled with unspoken words. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my arms. "I've never been more sure about anything," he said, his gaze steady on mine. The sincerity in his words brought tears to my eyes, and I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. When Derek arrived home, the house felt quieter, though Jake's presence still lingered in every corner. I found myself stealing glances at the couch where we'd shared so much the night before. The memories of his touch still fresh in my mind. Derek didn't notice my distraction, too busy recounting stories from his weekend with friends. But I couldn't help wondering how he would react if he knew the truth, if he knew about Jake and me. The thought terrified me, but it also made me realize something. For the first time in years, I was living for myself. The days that followed were a delicate balance of navigating this new reality. Jake kept his promise, calling every night and stopping by whenever he could. Each visit felt like a small piece of something bigger. A quiet reassurance that we were building something worth fighting for. There were moments of doubt, moments when the fear of what we were doing threatened to overwhelm me. But every time, Jake was there, his presence grounding me, reminding me that I didn't have to face this alone. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Jake reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I know this isn't easy," he said quietly. "It's not," I admitted, my voice soft, "but it's worth it." He turned to me then, his expression serious. "You're worth it, Claire." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my chest tighten with emotion. For so long, I'd convinced myself that I didn't deserve this, that my life was meant to be lived in the shadow of loss. But Jake's words, his presence, made me believe otherwise. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship grew stronger, though we kept it quiet, navigating the delicate balance of our circumstances. The house, once a place of quiet loneliness, had become a space of warmth and renewal. The rooms we'd worked on together felt like symbols of something bigger, something new and full of possibility. One afternoon, as we finished painting the final room, Jake turned to me, his eyes soft but full of determination. "This house feels different now," he said. "It does," I agreed, smiling as I looked around. "That's because of you," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Tears filled my eyes, and I reached for his hand, had my heart full. "No," I said softly, "it's because of us." The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. Because with Jake by my side, I knew we could face anything, together.